next, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, actually our next presenter, who's going to introduce our next presenter. So Clemens Steinbach, who is the consultant for the BC Center for Excellence in HIV/AIDS, and is also project director for the HRSA Ryan White HIV/AIDS program and Center for Quality Improvement and Innovation. So yeah, take it away, Clemens.
Thank you so much, Philip. And again, thank you so much, Elder Ruth, for your words. It's really my sincere and pleasure and honor to introduce our today's plenary speaker, Dr. Kira Mate. And it's really an honor to have you here, Kira. Dr. Mate is the president and CEO at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, IHI for short, and he's also faculty at the Wells Cornell Medical College. Dr. Mate is an inspirational leader, especially during the times of COVID, and with his focus on health system design and healthcare quality. And he and IHI is really committed to the values of equity and trust. Kira leads IHI, which is a major source of innovation in quality improvement, not only in the US and Canada, but also has initiated many groundbreaking initiatives across the world, including the very collaborative model we are using for this top collaborative. During the 2021 IHI Forum, Kira sparked an important discussion of trust and respect in healthcare system, particularly under the lens of being a prerequisite to improving care. We welcome Dr. Kira Mate, a national thought leader and inspirational innovator. And we particularly thank you for joining us today, given your busy schedule. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, Dr. Kira Mate has no relationship with a commercial sponsor, and he is affiliated with IHI as a nonprofit organization located in Boston, New York, and he has received a speaker fee that was being held by IHI. With that, and without further ado, Kira, we were looking forward to hear your thoughts, and particularly, again, thank you for being with us today.
Well, let me say it's a real pleasure to be with you. Can you, Clemens, can you confirm that you can hear me okay? Yes, I see the thumbs up. And let me also just say thank you to you, to Philip, to the entire top collaborative colleagues and leadership system and team. And in particular, thank you, Ruth, Elder Ruth, for your blessing and your welcome to the session. It was a privilege for me as well to hear your words blessing us and bringing us into the session. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm so grateful to you for the opportunity to share some thoughts around trust and why I think trust is so foundational and important to the work of improvement and what we can do about it. The challenges of trust, the fraying or fragmentation of trust that we are seeing in the market and in the environment, in health in general, and what we might as a group of leaders and improvers do about this notion. Philip, let me just ask you, can I share a screen, or is that something, is that okay with you? Okay, all right, so let me just make sure I get this right. And tell me if you can see my screen and see what
we see the slides, thank you.
Okay, you do, okay, great, perfect. So I'm gonna just, what I want to just start to share with you is the relationship between what you're doing in this collaborative and the tests of change that you're running in Plan, Do, Study. I saw the terminology on one of your slides there earlier, Philip, of running and building your confidence in running Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles. And when I first started in quality improvement, I've been working in this area for over 2 decades now. And when I first started in quality improvement work, I saw PDSA cycles as a vocabulary for how to take the challenges a system was experiencing and solve them in their parts. And I'll just give you just briefly my own, how I met and started working with IHI was almost more than 20 years ago now. I was a young physician working in Peru, in Lima, and we were doing work on drug-resistant tuberculosis treatment and therapy. And in that setting, people who were poor and living in peri-urban slums by and large, were dying of drug-resistant TB because the drugs were not available and they weren't being given to patients who needed them. And I was working with an organization called Partners in Health, and we had developed a very successful treatment program. Every day, we'd have these long queues of patients that would line up at the door. We'd treat as many of them as we could, eventually shutting the gates of the clinic. And at the end of the day, we would go home and wake up the next day, and the line was just as long as it had been the day before. It was a sort of endless stream of patients, as you can imagine, in this environment, where we weren't necessarily solving the system problems that were resulting in those patients being there. For that, we turned to IHI, and I first met Don Berwick when he came to visit to visit us in Peru. And I took Don around for almost a week, translating from English to Spanish his questions around systems thinking and system science, and asking people in our system what we could be doing. And what he presented was very simply the model for improvement and plan, do, study, act cycles, the very tools that you're using right now in this collaborative. And those tools, I realized, were a vocabulary for system change, a vocabulary for technically introducing these changes that were necessary to take better care of these patients and try to solve some of the upstream determinants of their challenge. I had, in that very short period of time, become a convert to improvement science and the methodology, because while as a physician, I knew the tools of how to take care of people clinically, I didn't know the tools and the approaches to solving system challenges. And Don and IHI and quality improvement and the PDSA cycles that you're learning were those tools to help introduce those kinds of system changes. But there was another part of the story that I didn't discover until much, much later on. And that's the part that I wish to talk to you about here today, which is that PDSA cycle that you're busy using to help you implement clozapine in your practice environments, that same PDSA cycle is quintessential, is vital to reinvigorate the human relationship that's at the center of the healing arts and the healing sciences. And to do that, I have to take you a little bit into this discussion of trust. What I've been learning as I've been working on this issue of trust is that it started really with a story that happened with me about this time last year. I met a project manager at IHI who was experiencing challenges in her work. And project managers are an incredible combination at IHI as well as elsewhere. They're an incredible combination of being very, very good, passionate improvers, but also being very practical tacticians who can get almost anything done. And this individual was someone that I'd worked with for years before she'd come to me in this meeting. We'd done a number of projects before. And when I became CEO of IHI, she wrote to me to congratulate me, to share her excitement, and to urge activities that we might carry forward into the future. Every month, every leader at IHI has a meeting, a stand-up meeting in which anyone in the organization can sign up for 10 to 15 minutes to talk about anything that's on their mind. And this particular meeting, this particular stand-up conversation with this project manager, when she came in, was about how she's feeling challenged. She was feeling challenges in her work. She was feeling challenges with her supervisor and with our culture. And I listened to her. I asked her some questions about the work and about what she was experiencing, mostly just offering to hear what she had to say and offering some empathy to her. But I could sense that she wanted to say something a bit deeper. And so I asked her to go there if she was willing. And she shared that while she, her direct quote now, trusted me, Kedar, completely, those are her words. She trusted me, the guy that she'd worked with for years on projects and programs. She felt that she could no longer trust the institution, our institution, and my office, the office of the CEO, not necessarily the person that occupied it, but the institution of the CEO, the structure, the position of the doctor in the doctor-patient relationship, felt threatened, felt challenged, felt difficult to trust. And it hurt to hear this, as you can imagine. This is someone that I'd worked with for years. We'd done a lot of, we tackled some of the biggest challenges in health and care together. And I knew I could rely on her skills and talents. And here she was telling me that she wasn't sure if she could trust me and my office any longer. What I wondered was really happening. And then I started looking at this question about trust, and I found evidence everywhere of a fragmenting and falling and failing trust. I found it in the data that we were seeing in the major institutions that we have, in government, in science, in medicine, in healthcare, in the military, in our fabled institutions like the media, in education, higher learning. We found in almost every one of these sectors, every one of these industries, you see the same pattern where trust peaked in the 50s and 60s and has been declining decade after decade ever since. And that stunned me. It made me curious about what was really happening here. And I could see expressions of it. And we've seen it play out in the pandemic response and how we've failed to trust or have been challenged around our trust in science, our trust in leaders, and our trust in government and public health as it tries to protect our people and indeed our institutions. We've seen trust fray as our leaders of our healthcare delivery environments have struggled to listen to the workforce as they've struggled to provide adequate protection, including PPE in the early stages of the pandemic, to our providers. So this phenomenon of trust being challenged has been at play in many, many different environments during this time. But I wondered whether or not, if trust was eroding, what would we do? And as I started digging into this question, I found the work of a sociologist named Rachel Botsman. And Botsman, in this book, Who Can You Trust? She writes something that was very interesting. She makes an observation. She writes that trust isn't falling altogether. It's just morphing. It's changing. And it's changing very, very, very quickly. She writes, trust, the glue that holds society together, hasn't disappeared. It's shifted. So consider this for a moment. Consider for a moment, if I had told you 15 years ago, or even 10 years ago, that you would travel to a city you've never been to before. You would get in the car of a perfect stranger at midnight. That perfect stranger would drop you off at a house that you've never been to of another perfect stranger. You would take the keys out of the lock box, and you'd enter that house. You'd stay there for the next 5 to 7 days in the house of a perfect stranger, completely safely. And then you would get back in the car of another perfect stranger, go back to the airport, and then go home. If I told you that story 15 years ago, you wouldn't believe me. In fact, many of us in our younger years were educated to not get in the cars of perfect strangers, and certainly not to get into the homes of perfect strangers. But as you know, I'm telling you the story of what Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, and many, many other organizations has done now for us fundamentally changing the way in which we trust. We trust now these large, decentralized networks of actors that we may never have met before. And it's a fascinating way and a confirmation of what Botsman describes. Trust isn't gone, it's just different. We struggle to trust centralized power, institutions, leaders, but we increasingly trust these decentralized large networks of almost unknown peoples and actors in our environments, in our communities. So I started looking for ideas about what we could do to build trust and how healthcare could do that. And I found the work of another researcher named Frances Frey. Frances Frey had studied trust in the context of one of these companies, in Uber, and she had described what she calls the trust triangle. Frey believes that there are 3 essential components of trust: empathy, logic, and authenticity. And here you see them on the screen. If you believe that my empathy is directed towards you, you are more likely to trust me. If you believe my reasoning, my logic makes sense, you are more likely to trust me. And if you believe that I am being authentic, true to my real self, then you are much more likely to trust me. And now you can hopefully start to see the potential connection of all of this to the healing arts and healing relationships that you all are fundamentally working on in this collaborative. These 3 things, empathy, logic, and authenticity, are both where trust begins and where it can break down. So I started to wonder, these are nice concepts and they're all well and good to talk about like this, but how do you actually build them? What can you do in your practice environments as clinicians, as caregivers, as practitioners? What can you do? What can we do in healthcare to start actually building this kind of trust with our patients, with our families, within our communities, within our practice environments, within our teams? What can we do to start building these kinds of relationships? Frey says the usual thinking around empathy is that we must walk in another person's shoes. But of course, this is almost impossible to do because I can't really know what it's like to walk in your shoes and vice versa from where I sit and where I've my lived experiences. So she describes the breakthrough in empathy is the concept of centering someone else's experience. You center that, and that becomes the heart of empathy. Choosing to spend time with another person and getting genuinely curious. That was the second ingredient, centering someone else and then getting genuinely curious about their experience, of what their experience has been and what it is. I can't walk in your shoes, Frey describes, but I can center you and I can learn from your experience by getting curious. This process of asking open and honest questions is vital to creating an empathetic understanding of each person's situation. The second component was logic, as I mentioned before. I won't trust what I can't understand. And it's hard to believe in someone whose judgment is suspect and who you feel you can't connect to and communicate with. Frey has an interesting way of describing problems in the trust triangle. She calls them wobbles. And she says when we have a logic wobble, it's usually that there's something about the design of our intervention that doesn't really make sense. For example, we might be seeing a patient in the emergency room over and over and over again and not asking what the root cause is, not seeing the whole story and the whole person. The other issue in driving logic challenges is a failure to communicate. I can't tell you how often we make this mistake in leadership. There's an old saying or an axiom from business school that says we have to communicate 8 times in 8 different ways. And that is so incredibly true and so very needed, especially during times where there's a lot of messages bombarding our patients and families, for example, during a pandemic. We have to communicate and over-communicate because we, as leaders and as people who have power of our position, we have knowledge and insight that make our decisions seem rational and reasonable to us, but may make no sense to the people we're trying to communicate it to. So we have to not only see the whole story, but we have to communicate our solution to the people that we're working with as often as we can. The last dimension is by far my favorite, and it's authenticity. You can't be good at being anyone but yourself. And it's hard to trust someone who isn't being their authentic self. There may be, of course, some powerful realities that prevent you from being you in every single situation. But without you being authentically you, trust will inevitably weaken and skepticism about intents and motivations will creep in. One of the most important aspects of authenticity is also consistency. In survey after survey, what people want from leaders and what they want from caregivers is follow through. Tell people where you're going, take them there, and then tell them where you've taken them. Trust doesn't get built overnight. You've got to listen, really understand, and act on what you're hearing and share that with folks over and over and over and over again. And perhaps on the 10th iteration of doing that consistently, people will trust that you mean what you say and you say what you mean. Consistency matters an enormous amount in the development of trust. So to illustrate this just for a minute, I want to talk about one family that I met as I was doing this trust research. The person on the right is Kyle Christensen. Kyle is a family medicine doc at what is known as Unity Point's Prairie Parkway Clinic in Iowa. He and his wife, who's right next to him, live in a small town in Cedar Falls in Iowa. And 7 years ago, Kyle and Jennifer's firstborn child, Ben, that's the person all the way on the left, came out to them as a transgendered male. Ben, their son, had experienced years of uncertainty and confusion about his gender identity and had even contemplated his own suicide. But Ben was resilient and persistent, and Kyle and Jennifer made a really important choice, not to retreat to denial, fear, ignorance, or otherwise, but instead to embrace Ben and his authentic self and to get really curious about what made Ben Ben. They chose to center someone else's experience, in this case, Ben's. And when they made that choice, they went all in. They learned everything they could about what it meant to be transgender. They learned that a staggering 82% of trans folks had considered suicide at some point in their lifetimes, that a third of trans folks will attempt suicide before the age of 18. And they heard countless stories of the medical system presenting barriers to care and actively withholding needed care from trans people. And armed with that knowledge, Kyle and Jennifer went to work. They opened the first of its kind LGBTQ clinic at Unity Point Prairie Parkway. And they were unbelievably nervous to do this. Kyle, when you talked to him about it, was terrified about doing this. It's a small town. They weren't sure how the community would respond, and they were frankly afraid. But they didn't cave into that fear and the inertia that it might lead to. They instead decided to find the energy based on what they knew was an authentic need that Ben had. And their enthusiasm and energy was met by energy and enthusiasm from all over the system. It's a beautiful story of a system responding to the need in a really incredible way. A half dozen physicians joined Kyle. You can see them here. You've got another half dozen nurses that joined Kyle. Pharmacy, laboratory, radiology, social work all came to their aid. And when they opened the doors of the clinic and welcomed their first patient by asking them what pronouns they use, they were greeted with energy and enthusiasm from throughout the community. Their clinic filled very quickly, and Unity Point's leadership has now committed to replicating this clinic across the Unity Point system. There's been 4 other similar clinics that have been already opened in different Unity Point regions around the country. Ben, by the way, is doing great. He's thriving. He lives in Chicago now. He works for an organization that's focused on social change. It's a really wonderful part of the story. But the reason I'm bringing this story to your attention is that when I was studying this question, Kyle raised this really interesting point to me. He said, I mentioned the suicide rate earlier among transgender people. It's incredibly high. And by the time trans people reach the age of 18, as I said earlier, nearly a third of them had attempted suicide. But there's an amazing and very interesting fact that's that's shown here on this slide. LGBTQ youth who report having just one accepting adult, an adult who says that adult that they can trust, an adult that says, I see you and I accept you for all you are in all your glory. Having that one trusting, accepting adult in their life reduces the risk of an actual suicide attempt by 40%. And what's amazing about this story is that literally anyone can be that person. And that's why Kyle has trained everyone in the Unity Point Prairie Parkway to come when someone walks in to say, welcome, what's your name and what pronouns do you use? Because every one of those moments is a time where you can build trust. It's from each of those those small moments where that trust really starts and where it builds and where it creates the powerful effect that you see here on this slide. Trust enables something else that I think is really important for us to consider and for you to consider as you do your work. Trust enables co-production of care and outcomes. And this ingredient, co-production, is what actually it takes to create the kind of lasting impact that changes the lives of your patients and families. So just for a moment, what's co-production in healthcare? Co-production is the interdependent work of users and professionals to design, create, develop, and deliver, and improve the relationships and the actions that contribute to health of individuals and populations. This is from a paper that a colleague and friend, Paul Batalden, wrote some years ago now. He was studying the work of Victor Fuchs. Victor Fuchs, a health economist, made the observation that healthcare is a service long ago in the 50s and early 60s. And what Victor was saying was that making a service is really very different from producing, a good or a product. Producing, food on an assembly line, canned food, or producing that kind of product is very different than producing a meal in a restaurant. The meal in the restaurant is a service. Producing the raw materials, the canned products, and otherwise goods, that's making goods. And those two things are very, very different. When you look at a healthcare service under a microscope, you see a set of relationships between the professionals and the patients, between all of you who are producing the care and the patients who could benefit from that care, and a set of activities that are necessary for creating better care and better outcome. And anchoring all of that, or creating the relationship, the connection between relationship and activity, is trust. But Paul Batalden made the observation that when we look at the healing sciences, it's as if we had reduced so much of what we do to the activity side of that equation, as if we reduced the act of healing to the placement of the bandage or the delivery of the medication, not recognizing the vast array of actors and their actions and relationships that were guiding and supporting and creating more healing in the approach that we're seeing. So this form of understanding, recognizing that not only are there a series of activities as shown here, but those activities are delivered through a set of relationships, and that what anchors those relationships is fundamentally trust, is what drove us to understand and really retool systems in pretty profound ways. Here's one example of how we've really changed the way that we've approached this by learning to co-produce care with our patients. This is an example from Sweden, from Jönköping, one of the regions that we work with in Sweden, and from a hospital called Ryhof Hospital, where a patient, a young man in his 30s, was diagnosed with a glomerulonephritis that required him to be on dialysis. Christian and his nurse, Britt Marie, began a relationship of dialysis because Christian now suddenly needed dialysis. Christian was a Saab engineer, and he started asking Britt Marie why they were doing certain aspects of dialysis the way that they were doing that. Why was it that you required to be hooked up to a machine for 6 hours a day during working hours, several days a week, often 3 to 5 days a week? And he asked Britt Marie if she could teach him how to dialyze himself, if she could teach him, an engineer, how to hook himself up to the machine, how to self-cannulate, and how to start administering his own dialysis. And Britt Marie didn't say no. This is the shocking and interesting part of the story. When she heard this, how many of you would have said, no, I'm not going to teach you how to self-cannulate, how to clean your own fistula, and how to hook yourself up to a dialysis machine? Instead, Britt Marie leaned into her relationship with Christian and said, I trust you with your own care, and I will help you to learn how to administer it yourself. And this led to a profound change in Sweden. That simple act of trust in relationship stimulated a completely different approach to dialysis. And this is what it looks like now. Christian learned first how to dialyze himself. Other patients started to say, why is that guy being able to dialyze himself? And so Christian taught the next person, who was an older woman, not an engineer, how to do it. And she taught the next person. And soon they had a whole dialysis unit that was working on this, that was being done and administered by the patients themselves. And then the patient said, why am I sitting here doing nothing? Let's exercise. And they brought in this exercise equipment. And then soon they brought in, because now they were freed from the constraints of having to be dialyzed from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., they instead started to ask about employment and getting jobs. For Christian, this became very profound. I have a new definition of health. I want to live a full life. I learned, I taught the next person to me. And now the care, this is interesting, the care is safer in my hands. Because of course, if it's your life that's on the line, if it's your bloodstream that can be infected, you better believe they're going to sterilize that fistula site incredibly, incredibly carefully. And from Britt Marie, she was surprised. She was surprised that this small act of trust and relationship led to this massive change in the system design. She was surprised at the design differences that she saw. There was the unit where the nurses were still operating on the old dialysis model, and it looked like the standard dialysis unit. And then you saw this other unit that looked like this, with folks on bikes and with weightlifting going on, and with job aids and people coming in from the employment agencies. You had the work was being managed at half the cost, a third of the cost, with better outcomes, lower cost, fewer complications, no infections. And because patients were now able to free their time and free their minds and free their hands, they were able to start getting new careers, which is kind of amazing at this stage of life. If you think that's a weird story in Sweden, let me just share with you some data from Texas where this was replicated. These are all patients, people that you see on the slide right now, they're all patients administering their own dialysis, drawing up their own dialysate, self-cannulating, sterilizing, etc. They're all their own patients doing this work. And when we looked at data from this site, we saw that the self-dialysis had a much lower mortality rate, almost 8-fold different between the usual dialysis in the same center and national averages and the self-dialysis, and the hospitalization rate almost a third of what it was in the usual case. So pretty profound changes that can happen. This has been replicated not only in dialysis, but in other care settings too. In orthopedic care, we did the same kind of thing. Again, trusting the relationship with patients and physicians and clinicians, excuse me, not just physicians, but clinicians as a whole. And they came up with a whole bunch of new designs, not rehab after the fact, but prehab, getting people ready so that after their total hip and total knee surgery, they would be ready to move on sooner back to home and out of the hospital environment. Less invasive techniques, multimodal anesthesia, rapid rehab protocols, as I mentioned, wellness design in the orthopedic units. You can see the design here on the bottom of what the orthopedic unit looked like in these patient co-designed and co-produced health units. And the results, stunning. Mortality rates lower, effectiveness rates higher, patient-centered mean satisfaction scores in the 99th percentile, length of stay lower, which means lower cost and better impact. That's what we get when we trust our patients and families and when we work in authentic relationship. I'll leave you with this a final couple thoughts here, and then we can take some questions. But I'll just say that I think the inclusion of patients, family, public, and community is no longer an if discussion, but when, where, and how are we going to do it? This is from Jim Conway, the former COO and executive vice president of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, passed away last year. But I think this is absolutely fundamentally true, and anchoring this question about patient, family, and public inclusion is our questions of co-production, and fundamentally behind that are matters of trust. Last thing that I'll share with you here is that is this quote from someone that I met along the way as I was doing my research around trust. It's Daniel Wolfson, who's the executive vice president from the American Board of Internal Medicine Foundation. He said something that I thought was so profound, I wrote it down. He said, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And such a fundamental part of the last 2 years of this pandemic has been a recognition of this specific and important notion. People have to know that you are authentically invested in them before they're ready to listen to any of the technical detail that we're willing to share with them. We can be as smart as we want. We can have the technical wisdom that we want. We can run the PDSA cycles. But until people know that what you're doing is because you care, we will struggle to create the kind of impact that we want to have in the world. So I'll just leave you with this last provocation. Maybe we can use the chat for this, if you will. But in the last month, as you've traveled and you've done your work, what's one thing you've seen, done, or heard that you believe has helped to build trust? What's one thing that you might have done in your environments? What's one thing that you might have seen, or what's one thing you might have heard that you think has helped to build trust? I'll leave the chat open here and would love to hear your thoughts on things that you've seen or heard that you think might be helpful, because it'll help us to build that kind of trust going forward. So I'll leave it there and take your questions as well in the chat. And I see there's some chats coming in, so let me just go there. And Clemens, you might guide me too if there are questions or comments.
Absolutely. So first of all, let me just thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. Lots of food for thought here. Let's hear, either put the comments in your chat room, but also if you want to, if you can unmute yourself, and we would love to hear your questions. Harish, do you want to quickly unmute and pose your question? Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Clement. Thank you, Kedar. That was very inspiring. Each time I hear you, I get more inspired. At the same time, I think one of the kind of a very big challenging issue for me and for my colleagues, if I can kind of speak for them, is that unlike regular medical care or internal medicine or other specialties, psychiatry, we have very unique challenges. For example, we are dealing with clients sometimes when they are acutely unwell, they have no insight, and some of them unfortunately lose insight in the long term. And to make the matters worse, I think communicating with family has almost become a taboo because of consent issues. So in this kind of very difficult to navigate mental health, you have any thoughts or suggestions for us?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't want to get, I think the family is sometimes going to be helpful to you and not always in this particular kind of case. If you don't have consent issues worked out, then I can see how that would be potentially very challenging. And there your opportunity is to work directly with your clients. Not every client situation is going to be one in which you can necessarily create or co-produce the outcome. But I'm talking about at a population level, as you start to look at the myriad needs that you might have across a potential patient population, and hopefully across at least several families and caregiving environments that might have insight or knowledge that if the patients themselves don't have it, then hopefully you can gather from those sources the required amount of insight that you might need in order to start to develop what a better and more co-produced outcome would be. So I gather your point, which is that we have, sometimes there are inhibitors to patients participating or co-producing the outcome that you want, or that sometimes there are legal matters that might complicate or prevent family members or otherwise from making specific contributions in an individual's circumstance or setting. But here we're thinking about this more at the level of the whole population. I give you that story of the dialysis patient. In part, that happens because there's an individual that can do it to begin with, but then it starts to break the seal really around that. It starts to create opportunity for others to engage in similar ways that might not have seen themselves as doing that kind of thing in their own history. The very next patient, as Christian describes, that he taught was an 80-year-old woman. I don't know that she would have seen herself doing that had it not been for that initial case, which I think was really vital or critical to see happen. So I think that is at a population level, you can get the kinds of insights around what will help to co-produce outcomes more successfully with individuals. So that's sort of one way of tackling this challenge with an individual case. Either the patient lacks clarity or insight, or the family is prevented from providing that kind of insight. And often there are some form of caregiver in the environment that can give you some insights as to what you think could really help going forward.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Don't forget to unmute. Would love to hear your comments or even reflections. We also put the question in the chat room. What is the one thing that you have done, seen, or heard that you believe build trust with a client?
It looks like Carlos is adding something to this notion of the LEAP approach to helping to manage patients or clients that have low insight and working with families. I also see above a comment about how COVID has certainly challenged trust in new and more profound ways than perhaps it was there before. I think Rolando, your point is well taken. It's in part what I think led to this question for me about what is changing in our environment. Why is there such a massive erosion in public confidence around science and health than we've ever seen, really. And I think you're absolutely right that rapidly changing advice and knowledge, we were literally making the sausage as it was being, you're watching the sausage being made, as it were, and the public was watching sausage as it was being made. And there's a lot of concern around that. And frequently changing recommendations certainly are a big contributor to this, no doubt about it.
Peter, there's one other question in the chat room that reads the following way from Brandel. Another challenge is how to make the health organization or program come across as authentic when it's large and at times impersonal, and I add bureaucratic.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Well, I think a lot of what there's ways of translating those ideas, empathy, authenticity, and logic at the individual level. And that's probably the easiest for any one of us as practitioners to try to imagine, how do we generate more empathy with our clients and our patients and our families? How do we create more logical approaches? How do we behave more authentically in our environments? But there is another way in which institutions can do that. So the institutions can do the same kind of conceptual, use the same elements of the trust triangle to essentially practice as an institution in their community, instead of thinking of instead of it being a clinician-client relationship, it's organization-community relationship. That's the axis. And you can still practice the same form of empathy, logic, and authenticity at that organizational or institutional level. So you can just imagine that consistent on the authenticity side, consistency and seeing the whole problem and starting to build empathetic relationship with communities is an important way for us to start to build the kind of trust that organizations need with communities. This is fundamental to equity work, as you can imagine. It's fundamental to really thinking very differently about how we connect to our communities going forward. So exactly right in terms of your thinking. Take the same triangle, the behaviors are slightly different, but the ability, the desire, the idea of sitting down with community, learning together what matters to them, being focused on developing solutions to those problems, and doing so in a way that's consistent and authentic over time is essentially not a dissimilar set of actions to how we might interact interpersonally. It's just a different order of magnitude.
I also would like to add that, it always starts with one client, one patient, and one provider. The notion that if you can be the contact person for one who, your example about somebody who is in a gender identity crisis, that one person can make a difference. And I think similar when big organizations are made of hundreds of thousands of people potentially. So if you could start with one client, one provider, I think we're on the path of success, and therefore make it more personal and more approachable.
That's right.
Wonderful. So we're running out of time a little bit, but I think I would encourage you to keep on writing the wonderful messages in the chat room. We're certainly, it's time of reflection, and we would love to see more about it. But with that, I wanted to a big thank you, and you may have seen this, Kida, but we want to give her a big round of applause, which is the sign language for giving a big round of applause for all of us who have their cameras on. And we want to thank you. I really, really appreciated that you're with us today. And it was a very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege for me, and I just want to say thank you to all of you for the work that you're doing and trying to help your folks as much as you are. So thank you so much. It's a privilege, and look forward to hearing how you progress. I hope you'll stay in touch with us at IHI.